Today, we're going to talk about one of the most incredible and honestly tragic figures in all of history, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. But you probably know him by his much more haunting title, the Leper King. So from 1174 to 1185, he was the king of this really vibrant, multicultural crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. But here's the thing, he was a king unlike any other. He was holding on to power while fighting an enemy that was, well, far more relentless than any army he'd ever face on a battlefield.
And this is really the heart of his story, right? It's just full of these crazy contradictions. He was a celebrated warrior who literally couldn't feel the sword in his own hand. A king crowned when he was just a teenager, knowing full well he had no future. A brilliant leader who had to go head-to-head with the legendary Saladin, all while his own body was just betraying him, slowly falling apart.
So where does a story like this even begin? Well, his tragedy doesn't start on some grand battlefield. No, it starts in a moment of all things, simple childhood play.
Okay, so picture this. As a young boy, Baldwin's tutor, who happens to be the famous historian William of Tyre, notices something terrifying. The boys are all playing a game, pinching each other like kids do. But Baldwin? He never cries out. He doesn't even flinch. And that's when William realizes, with this dawning horror, that the young prince can't feel any pain in his right arm. It was the very first sign of something absolutely devastating.
And that illness was leprosy. Now you have to understand, in the medieval world, this wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a curse. It was more than a death sentence. It meant horrible nerve damage, physical disfigurement, and it meant being completely cast out from society. It was, without a doubt, the disease that people feared more than anything else.
The law at the time was crystal clear. If you had leprosy, you were isolated. You were sent to live in a colony, far away from everyone else. His future wasn't supposed to be a throne. It was supposed to be a segregated colony. Sovereignty was completely out of the question. And yet, Baldwin's spirit just refused to break. He's described as being incredibly intelligent and determined, even optimistic. And get this, he even mastered horse riding, which was essential for a knight. He learned to control his horse using only his knees because he couldn't feel his limbs. On top of all that, he had this razor-sharp memory. He never, ever forgot a kindness or a slight.
And then, everything changes. At just 13 years old, his father dies. And this sick boy, this kid who by all rights should have been an outcast, is suddenly crowned king. King of a nation that was already teetering right on the brink of collapse. So yeah, he's crowned at 13. For the first couple of years, some powerful nobles act as his regents, ruling in his name. But by 15, he steps up. He asserts his own authority and takes personal command of the whole kingdom. Just pause and think about that for a second. A 15-year-old with leprosy is now the absolute ruler.
And the situation he inherited? Man, it was precarious. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was basically this thin, vulnerable strip of land, and it was almost completely surrounded by the growing empire of one of the greatest military leaders in history, the one and only Saladin.
Now you can imagine, right? This vulnerable kingdom with a sick teenager on the throne, it's like a giant flashing invitation for an invasion. And that's exactly what happened. And it led to what is, without a doubt, Baldwin's most legendary and most completely improbable moment. So, it's November 1177. Saladin decides to make his move. He invades with a massive army, figuring the kingdom is basically defenseless. And why wouldn't he? The main Crusader army was way up north. The only thing standing in his way was a 16-year-old king and whatever handful of men he could scramble together. I mean, how could this possibly end in anything but a total disaster?
Okay, let's just look at the numbers for a second because they're absolutely staggering. Baldwin had maybe a few hundred knights and some foot soldiers. Saladin's army reports put it at around 26,000 soldiers. The odds weren't just bad, they were basically impossible. Saladin, thinking Baldwin is trapped and poses zero threat, gets a little overconfident. He lets his army spread out, marching casually towards Jerusalem. But Baldwin? He does the unthinkable. He bursts out of the city of Ascalon, and this 16-year-old kid, his body already ravaged by his illness, personally leads the charge right into the side of Saladin's totally unsuspecting army. And the result? It was one of the most stunning upsets in all of medieval history. Saladin's army was completely shattered. Saladin himself barely escaped with his life. It's said that only about a tenth of his huge army actually made it back to Egypt. A 16-year-old had just completely crushed a living legend.
But here's the thing. As amazing, as heroic as that victory was, it couldn't solve the kingdom's deeper problems. Baldwin was about to find out that his most dangerous enemies weren't across the battlefield, they were right there in his own court.
See, Baldwin couldn't get married, he couldn't have children. Everyone knew he was going to die young. So the single biggest question, who comes next, it just tore the kingdom apart from the inside. It created this constant, simmering battle for power.
Basically, the court split into two camps. On one side, you had his mom's relatives, the Courtenays. They were kind of the newcomers, and he tended to favor them. On the other side, you had the old guard, the established barons whose families had been there for generations. So Baldwin had to spend the rest of his life desperately trying to keep these two groups from tearing each other and the kingdom apart, constantly putting out political fires, all while his own health was getting worse and worse.
And you can just feel the weight of this in his own words. At one point, he actually wrote a letter to the King of France, basically begging him to send someone to take over. He knew his own weakness was putting the kingdom he loved in danger. I mean, talk about a heartbreaking admission of his reality. But even then, he refused to just fade away. Not Baldwin. As his body was completely giving out, he somehow summoned the strength for one last, absolutely incredible stand. Okay, so in his final years, his body is just failing him. By 1183, he's blind, he can't walk without help, and yet he is still making huge, decisive moves. First, he fires his own brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, from being regent because the guy was just incompetent. Then, he secures the future by having his 5-year-old nephew crowned as his co-king. And then, and this is just pure will, he has himself carried on a litter at the head of his army one final time to force Saladin to back down from a siege. Think about that image. He was physically helpless, literally a dying man being carried into a war zone. But his presence alone was enough. Just the sight of their king refusing to give up, refusing to surrender to his fate, it inspired so much loyalty that his army followed him without question. And his enemies, they retreated. Baldwin finally died in 1185. He was only 23 years old. And his true legacy, you don't really see it in what he did while he was alive, but in what happened the second he was gone. See, while he lived, he somehow kept all those squabbling nobles in line. He held Saladin at bay. He preserved the kingdom. And after he died, chaos. The divisions he'd managed just exploded. Just 2 years later, Saladin crushes the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and takes Jerusalem. Everything Baldwin had fought so hard to protect was gone. Which leaves us with one last, really powerful question. For about a decade, a dying boy held one of the world's most powerful empires at bay, pretty much through sheer force of will. When you look at how fast it all fell apart without him, you just have to wonder, was this one incredible, leprous king the only thing that stood between the Crusader kingdom and its complete and total destruction?